All right, let's grab our Bibles and go over to Daniel chapter 6, and we are going to look at this remarkable man's life and a couple of things about his character that speak to our current series, which is, My God is so big, so strong, and so mighty, there's nothing my God cannot do. And today is one that I think will speak to your life. All of us have things that we go through that are bigger than ourselves. And as we do, we can, as we talked about the last couple of weeks, we can start to think those problems are bigger than our God. But that's not true. And God's going to prove it in Daniel chapter 6. Daniel's, as I said, he's a remarkable character. In the beginning of the book, he is a young man, probably older teenager, maybe young 20s, somewhere in there. And he is carted off along with several other faithful young men from Jerusalem to the capital of the Babylonian Empire, Babylon. This is like being carried off to the Death Star in the Jewish world of Daniel's time. I mean, really and truly, Nebuchadnezzar is Darth Vader, Babylon is the Death Star. This is huge empirical stuff, right? And it would make sense for anyone being carted off as a slave, which Daniel was, being carted off as a slave to be forced into what we would consider white-collar labor, so different from slavery as we often think of it, but still slavery. And the Babylonians were a violent and harsh people to their enemies. So I'm not going to soften that any, but he is going to a white-collar sort of a job. He's going to work for government. He's going to become a bureaucratic slave. That's kind of a hard thing for us to wrap our minds around, right? But that's what he was. And he was going to go through years of training, physical, educational, cultural, linguistic, even having to study the Babylonian idolatrous religions in order to know how that government worked, because their idolatry and their government order were completely tied together. It was state idolatry. And that's going to play into the reading that we have today in Daniel chapter 6. And he had to study all of that stuff. And he had to work within a government that he didn't believe in, that he didn't agree with, that he didn't share principles with. And maybe you can relate. Maybe that's how you feel about the big E. I'm not going to talk about the election today or politics or any of that stuff. But maybe that's how you feel about that. Maybe that's how you feel about where you work. You know, there are people, I won't name what their job is or who they are in relation to me, but I know people close to me right now that are really sweating some things that are possible within their own job, because of new laws and regulations and things being considered in Austin and in Washington that would really make it difficult for them to do their job according to those things with a clear conscience. And Daniel went through that. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if you're familiar with the book of Daniel, you're familiar with them. They went through those times. We recently studied this book kind of from that point of view, based on the book called Thriving in Babylon. And if you've never read it, I do recommend Thriving in Babylon. It's a study of the book of Daniel and the character of these men and their faithfulness in spite of their circumstances and surrounding. But I wanted to look, if you were in that study, we're not studying the same thing today. I wanted to look at chapter 6 because this is the story of Daniel in the lion's den. This is when Daniel is an older man. When he was carted off as a slave to Babylon, like being carted off to the Death Star and everything, he was a young man, 19, 20, somewhere in there, in that neighborhood. And yet he already had an incredibly deep and convicted faith. And he exercised that faith obediently, he exercised that faith humbly, but he exercised that faith always respectfully. And I want to look at three character traits in particular, and that's one of them, because I think we need to relearn what Daniel has. I think as the church, in a culture drunken right now with disrespect, and it doesn't matter whether you are talking about the culture wars or politics or what. It's just right now, we are in an era of disrespect. respect, of anger, and of bitterness. And that is never what the people of God are called to be. But we try to paint it like, well, as long as it's because of holy reasons and our convictions, that it's okay to be ungodly in our attitudes. And of course, ungodly is ungodly no matter what your motive. And if you're going to do godly things, if you're going to stand for godly principles, you have to do it with a godly attitude and a godly heart. And that is easier said than done, but it ain't optional as a disciple of Christ. It wasn't optional for Daniel either, as a faithful young Jewish man living in Babylon. And yet, throughout his life, that is the kind of person he was. He was faithful, and he was humble, and he was respectful. So here's three things that I think we can get. There's more than that, but there are three I want us to catch today as we look at Daniel in Babylon. And this first point, if you're a note taker, go ahead and put this down. This first point is, if you find yourself in Babylon, be a Daniel. A good friend from, she's originally from Michigan, she posted this on her Facebook wall the other day. And, I love memes because sometimes they're goofy and they bring a laugh, and that's really what I need some days. And sometimes they can speak truth in really short, powerful ways, and that is one of them. When you find yourself in Babylon, be a Daniel. Well, what would that mean? What does it mean to be a Daniel? That's kind of like when we say, we need to be Jesus to people. Okay, what does that mean? How does that flesh itself out? For Daniel, that meant, in chapter 1, as a young man, it meant being faithful to the convictions of his heart, even when the whole world was against him. And when the whole world was, even when they unintentionally were against him, he had to be faithful. And the first example you come across is that in Daniel chapter 1, they take them captive, they take them into Babylon, and they are going to give them food. They want them to go through a rigorous physical regime, educational regime, and religious regime. And the first part of that was the physical. They wanted to get them in shape. These were going to be men who represented the king of Babylon, the most powerful nation on earth. And he didn't want, some sloppy old guys representing him. He wanted the fit and the fittest and the best and the smartest and the brightest. And so that's what he was going to shape them up to be. Well, that involved food that for a young Jewish man would not have been kosher, to use the words that we use today. It would not have been lawful for him to have eaten. So, we don't have all of the details of what that would have been, but, there were just things that they were not supposed to eat. And you can go back to Leviticus and find all of that stuff, right? It would be easy, I think. I don't know for sure, but I think it would be easy for a lot of us to compromise on that. I will tell you that and I think you know this. I think you can look at your little screen there and you can tell. I like food, and I love food that tastes good. And that might be an easy thing to say. Well, but it's not. Is that the biggest deal? If it's a threat of prison, or if I become a slave who's out there breaking rocks, maybe it's better to stay where I am and eat shrimp. Is this the biggest deal? I think that might be, for a lot of people, an easy thing to rationalize and justify. But Daniel, being the faithful man he was, a man of integrity, would not do it. And so in chapter 1, we see him go to the guy who oversees we're going to call it a program here, oversees his training program, and says, I can't do this. And my brothers here, they can't do it either. So I've got a proposal. He says, we can't eat that food, but if you will give us just vegetables, if you'll just feed us things that are totally kosher and safe, then, and of course, kosher didn't require just vegetables, but it was one of those things that it simply was the easiest, best way for Daniel to approach this and still be sure that he was remaining faithful. He said, if you'll do that, then give us 10 days. If we are in the condition we ought to be, and we're not falling apart over here, and we're getting the job done, then will you respect our convictions and let us serve as we're being made to serve but to do it with integrity and with faithfulness to our God. The leader of the program is apprehensive, but he gets the permission that's necessary, and he's nervous. And so he's telling Daniel, 10 days, okay, we're checking this, and it better be. Okay, 10 days, it was. In fact, they had gotten stronger and more fit, and so they are impressed with Daniel and these young men, and they respect their requests and allow them to live faithfully and with integrity. Okay, so that sets the stage for us in chapter 1 of who this man Daniel was. That he was a person who lived his faith, lived by integrity. Now, there are some other things about it. He did all this with respect. So he's faithful, he's true to his convictions, and he has integrity. Should you be that? Should I be that? Absolutely. When we talk about faithful stewards of God's Word and faithful, obedient servants of God and disciples of Jesus Christ, faithfulness, integrity is core. It is indispensable. You can't be a faithful Christian and not be faithful to your convictions. It's antithetical, right? It's just that's who we have to be. It's who we're called to be. And Daniel was that kind of a guy, and so were the other men with him. In his faithfulness, though, he had something that we really need, okay? And I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I see it all the time. But it doesn't exist to the extent that it should in our current climate. It's something we, as a church as a whole, we need to watch ourselves and be careful. We have to purposefully decide to be this next thing, and that is respectful. Daniel, nowhere in the book of Daniel is he, or for that matter, Shadrach, Meshach, or Abednego, or any of the others, are they ever disrespectful to their captors. And that might seem strange to us. Our culture at large doesn't work this way. The world at large doesn't work this way. We tend to think that it is impossible to be respectful unless the other person is deserving in every possible way of that respect. When I say we, I mean we, okay? That's kind of how I think a lot of the time. And that's just, that's a confession that I still have room to grow, because what I'm telling you is that's actually not true. In fact, I remember as a child, okay? And this is it's one of those moments you would take back, okay? I remember as a child that I told an adult one time, if you want respect, this adult was saying, you got to respect me. And they had just done something that wasn't that respectful. And I smarted off as a kid, if you want respect, it's a two-way street, and you have to earn it too. Okay, there is a truth in that. One of the truths is I should have spoken better to an adult as a child, and I learned that lesson effectively in that moment because I had a parent involved in the room, and I was corrected, as I should have been, by the parent. There is truth to that. If we want respect, we do need to earn it, but there is also another truth. Sometimes people are in position to have our respect whether they deserve it or not. They are in positions to have our respect whether they've earned it or not. And it's not because of them at all. It's because we lose our own integrity. We lose our own respectability. We lose our own faithfulness to God when we withhold rightful respect that's due. Now let that sink in for a moment, because that's not something James is saying. That's something that was taught to us by Jesus. When Jesus was talking to his disciples and other people gathering around to hear the truths he told, he's having battle every day at that point in his ministry with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the teachers of the law. They are not exercising their role faithfully, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the teachers of the law. They are rejecting God's truth. They are rejecting the Messiah. They are rejecting the evidence that God is putting forth through the power of the Holy Spirit, through the miracles, testifying that Jesus is the Son of God. They are fighting God. And yet, Jesus says to the followers, but while I don't want you to imitate them, they are in their rightful position. They sit in the seat of Moses, meaning they have authority. They have rightful from God leadership. And Jesus says, and you need to listen to them and follow their leadership and authority so long as you're following God. But that he says they sit in Moses' seat, and you aren't going to live like them, but you have to respect their position. That's not the way we like to think, is it? And yet that's what he says. That's where Daniel finds himself, too. And of course, Daniel hadn't heard that from Jesus. He hadn't heard from Paul that we have to respect those who are in authority, whether those are elders of the church or whether they are those in government and authority, that we have to show a proper respect. You respect the office, even if you don't respect the person. And so those things happen all the time. And when I was a child, it was an adult authority figure that I needed to show respect. Did they deserve it in that moment? Not fully based on things they had just said, but they did, because they fulfilled a God-given role of authority that I, as a child, was supposed to respect. And that's true as adults as well. And it was true for Daniel in Babylon. And so we see that at the very beginning, that he shows that respect. And he does it here in Daniel chapter 6. So Daniel is faithful. Daniel is respectful and respectable. And he's obedient to God. He doesn't let up on his convictions. We have this myth, and we need to address it. We have a myth in our church mindset and the culture at large that to be respectful, to be kind to people with whom we disagree, and especially authorities with whom we disagree, is somehow to compromise our faith. And that is, to use a deep theological term, hogwash. Being a respectful person is respecting and reflecting the mind and the heart of Christ. Jesus at no time ever was disrespectful, not even to Pilate, not even to Herod. And Herod was an awful man. Pilate was bad. Herod was awful and a hypocrite on many more levels even than Pilate. He was never even disrespectful to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the teachers of the law. He was pointed at times. Okay, he spoke truth to power, which is kind of a funny thing because their power was less than his, their authority was less than his, but he spoke truth. But even when he spoke to Satan, he wasn't a jerk. And if anybody had the right to be, it would have been Jesus, and he never was. Jude. We were studying Jude Thursday in our Bible study at Riverside Park. And one of the things we talked about, because you can't miss it in the book of Jude, is this story about Michael the archangel arguing over the body of Moses with the devil. And Jude brings the story up. Jude, by the way, most likely the brother of Jesus. He tells that story to remind us, while warning about false teachers, that one of the characteristics of a false teacher, of a false prophet, of a false disciple, a false Christian, one of the marks of a false Christian, a false disciple, is an arrogance whenever they think they're right, and this constant berating of the other. And so Jude uses the example to say, you know how you can tell these guys are false? They don't respect anybody. They slander even the angels. They slander spiritual beings. They say, but Archangel Michael didn't even slander the devil himself. He was still respectable even while disputing, arguing, debating with the devil over the body of Moses. And so he uses that as a way to say that kind of an attitude never belongs in a disciple of Jesus Christ. And that kind of action does not belong. That we are to be people who are respectful and respectable, regardless of the other person, because it's just not always even about them. You need to maintain your integrity of respectability and your integrity of obedience. And you don't have to compromise one to do the other. Daniel was completely obedient in respecting God and the purity laws of the law of Moses. He was completely respectable and respectful while saying, I understand this is what you guys do, but we can't eat this. It's against our faith. And we need to learn, again, how to do that, how to respectfully and kindly say, and even put ourselves on the line and say, listen, I'm going to hold myself to this. I'm going to be a man of integrity. I'm going to be, for you, a man or a woman of integrity. But I can't violate what God wants me to do. But I will show you respect as I live my obedient life. And I will even work to your good while I do it. You know, the prophet Jeremiah had to deliver the message to the people of God that they were to pray for the city in which they lived when they were taken captive. That they were to pray for those people and to work and to pray for the good, even of their captors, because they were to be, what is salt and light? A blessing to everyone around them. And because in order for their life to be good, everybody's life has to be good, right? We don't get our groceries only from people who are faithful. We get them from people who completely are diametrically opposed to our beliefs at times. But I still pray for their good. And you should still pray for their good. And we still will say, God bless you. And we still will live a life that is blessing to our neighbors, even if they don't share our beliefs. Even if our leaders don't share our beliefs. Because it's not about them. It's about our faithfulness to God. Our God is so big. And His agenda is so big. And faithfulness to Him is so important that a rubber stamp from the people around us approving it isn't needed. It isn't needed because God will help us to live faithful lives regardless. Now let's look at Daniel chapter 6. We're going to get there, I promise. Daniel chapter 6 and this moment that happens. So we come into a moment where the king is about to give Daniel this big promotion, and he's going to have a job working as a satrap over all of the kingdom of Babylon. Isn't that wild? It's kind of like the Joseph thing, right? Where he is going to have this huge, important job within the kingdom of Babylon. And the problem is he has some rivals within the bureaucracy who are threatened by his success. I mean, he's an outsider and he is being promoted above people from within, and he is being shown honor greater than some of the Babylonians. And so they're talking trash about him, and they're thinking that he doesn't deserve this position, and what can we do to stop it? And so they come up with this plan. They go to the king, who at this time is King Darius, and they say to Darius, you know, we think you ought to make a law, and this is all the setup, right? We think you ought to make a law that for 40 days, no one is to be worshiped or prayed to except for you. Oh, great, wonderful King Darius, you're so awesome. We just think that you deserve 40 days of praise and prayer just to yourself. And if anybody prays to another god or person, then they should be thrown into the lion's den. Well, they put all of that in writing. This is all 1 through 9. Darius, being a weak man, it gets to his ego, right? And he goes, that sounds good. I could use a little extra praise this week, right? And so he agrees to it. Problem is, and it's going to come back to bite him, is once he makes this law, he can't repeal the law. And Daniel is going to do what? As a faithful man of integrity. Okay, verse 10, let's read this together. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room, where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. And so they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except for you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? And the king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree that you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed, and he was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. And when the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. And the king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his place and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment, without being brought to him, and he could not sleep. All right, let's stop there and look at some of the details here. So Daniel hears about the decree, and the first thing he does is to pray. But what's interesting is it's not like one of those emergency prayers. A friend of mine used to call them flare prayers. That's hard to say. Say that 3 times fast. Flare prayers. And that's where you, "Oh, Lord, help me, I'm in trouble." "Oh, Lord, help me, I'm in trouble again." But the rest of the time, you've treated prayer like nothing, right? That is not Daniel. Why? Because he's faithful, he's respectful and respectable, and he's obedient to God. And he's constantly in prayer to God. And so when this happens, he prays. But the book points out, hey, Daniel did this all the time. He prayed 3 times a day, as he had always done. And there's something else that's interesting about Daniel's faithfulness in his prayers. This is the crime he committed. He was thankful. He was what? No, he wasn't. He was planning his next line of argumentative attack. No, he was thankful. No, he wasn't. He was finding more words to use and more links to share. No, he wasn't. He was thankful. If a wicked bureaucrat was trying to find charges to get you thrown in jail, would the charge be 3 times a day, prayers of gratitude, and the other thing he prayed about was just asking for help? Would that be your crime? If the words of your mouth were known to everybody that you've spoken in the last week or month or year were broadcast on a loudspeaker, would your crime be gratitude and prayers for the help from the Lord to continue to be a faithful, obedient disciple with integrity, despite the circumstances? Or would there be something else on our dockets? This is why I like Daniel. This is why God liked Daniel, okay? So the king likes him so much. Even the worldly king liked Daniel, even though they disagreed on probably almost every moral and religious level you could think of. Darius still respected him. Why? Because of the kind of character he showed, because of the way that he reacted and responded in times of hardship and in times of persecution. Darius had tremendous respect, did everything even in the king's power, but was not able because of his mistake earlier of putting this in writing. Everything in his power to try and save his life. And then the last thing Darius says to Daniel before they seal the lion's den with the stone is, "May your God, whom you serve continually." What does that tell us about Daniel's life? Even the king was aware of what an incredibly faithful life he lived of service to God. "May your God, whom you serve continually, save you." And it wasn't said in sarcasm. It wasn't like the men who yelled at Jesus and said, "Oh, well, if you're really Elijah, come on down. If you're really the Son of God, come on down. Pray to your God and maybe he'll send angels to save you." It was not mockery. It was respect. Would your enemies right now, people you perceive to be your enemies, if they saw the way that you talk about them, would they be praying for your release and doing everything they could to help you? Or would they say, "Good riddance"? That tells us a lot about our life and our heart. I wonder what people would say about us in that situation. We know what they said about Daniel, and it's awesome. So after that night, the king couldn't sleep. And it's telling when a king says, I don't want food and I don't want entertainment, turn the TV off. And he couldn't even sleep. Verse 19, at the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. Shows how much he really respected and appreciated Daniel. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? And Daniel answered, may the king live forever. Wow, now think about that for a second. Here's a guy taken into slavery, taken into service in Babylon by the greatest enemy of the people of God in maybe, you could argue, in its history up to that point. May the king live forever. He blesses him. My God has sent his angel and shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. And the king was excited, orders that he be let out because he had trusted in God. All of this was because he had trusted in God. What an incredible story of faith. We serve a big God, a God who can send an angel to shut the mouths of the lions, who was able to preserve Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fires when they were under similar circumstances. But we also serve a big God who shapes and changes our hearts and rescues us because we're people of faith and people of integrity, people of obedience, and people of respect and respectability. We need to remember that that was a big part of why Daniel said God saved him. Daniel said that one of the reasons he was saved is because he had been respectful and obedient not only to God, but even to his captor king. So, when we're tempted to think that it's okay to treat people in the world with less respect because we disagree on religious issues, or we disagree on just life issues, or we disagree on political issues, educational issues, whatever it is, we're wrong. And we don't follow the examples that God has set before us in Scripture. The examples of people who showed respect and showed kindness, even when it was undeserved. Not because of who the other people were, but because they served a big God who was bigger than their challenges, their hardships, and even bigger than persecution and the threat of death. I hope we remember that in the days going forward. I hope we remember that whatever the challenges may be, at whatever level they may be, some of these things may just be within your own household. Sometimes you're going to have to respect family that aren't easy to respect because it's the right thing to do. Sometimes you're going to have to be uncompromising in your convictions, but kind-hearted and patient in your demeanor because it's the right thing to do. And our big God has a big vision for all this. So that, Paul says this to Timothy, so that those people that we are respectful to, kind to, even when we disagree, open their minds and their hearts to the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's why we need to be uncompromising in our kindness, in our love, and our respect, because you can't save souls when you're fighting souls, but you can when you're fighting for. And Daniel constantly had that vision of trying to bring people to faith in God, and he constantly did. At this point, he was an older man. That was wisdom he had, though, from his youth. Decades of faithful service and kindness and respectfulness had done Daniel well, and they will do us well too.